My name is Suzanne Carey. I'm the president of the Board of Trustees of the J. Heritage Center, and welcome today. How many of you have been here before? Oh, that's good. That's good. And how many of you, this is your first time? All right, well, hopefully you're going to come back, and we'll give you some reasons to come back after the program, at the end of the program. Well, we are absolutely delighted to have the two speakers that we have today, Professor Kermit Roosevelt and Professor Akhil Amar. Many of you are either related to them. I know there's some cousins, right? There's some Roosevelt cousins in the room. And or know them from their schools. But let me give you just a little brief synopsis about both of them. And then what we're going to do is we're going to have a conversation about our country, the challenges we're going through. The conversation may be about 30, 45 minutes, and then we'll take questions from the audience. So as you listen, as you digest all of this really interesting information, feel free to ask questions that may be at the top of your mind. Put my glasses on first. So our first speaker, Professor Kermit Roosevelt, is the David Berger Professor for Administration of Justice at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. He graduated summa cum laude and Phi Beta Kappa from Harvard in 1993 and was a 1997 graduate of Yale Law School, where he was senior editor of the Yale Law Journal and editor of the Yale Journal on Regulation. He clerked for the Honorable Stephen F. Williams of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit and the Honorable David Souter of the U.S. Supreme Court. He is currently the reporter for the third restatement of conflict of laws and working on a project he'll tell us about a little bit later. He works in a diverse range of fields, focusing on constitutional law and conflict of laws. And remember that word conflict. You're going to hear a lot about it today, in addition to the word constitution. His works offer accessible overviews of both subjects, and one very topical book in particular, The Myth of Judicial Activism, Making Sense of Supreme Court Decisions, sets out, it's very topical, right? Sets out standards by which citizens like us can determine whether the Supreme Court is abusing its authority to interpret the Constitution, something in the forefront of all of our minds. For those of you who prefer fiction to nonfiction, he is also a creative writer and the author of 2 novels. In the Shadow of the Law, this takes place with a pro bono murder case and a class action lawsuit brought against a large chemical company, and presents a fascinating, well-researched cast of conflicted, there's that word again, characters in the legal world. He's also written another thriller called Allegiance a la Scott Turow that plunges readers into the historic debate within the U.S. government that surrounded the imprisonment of thousands of Japanese Americans during World War II. So some fascinating reading. And for those of you who want to buy books, I'm going to plug the books early. We've got many books to buy after the talk. But today we're here to hear about his most recent book, The Nation That Never Was, Reconstructing America's Story, in which Roosevelt makes the argument that a traditional American narrative that our fundamental values as a country, stated in the Declaration of Independence, fought for in the Revolution, and made law in the Constitution, is neither useful nor true. We're going to talk about that. Instead, he writes, we should look to the 19th century, to the period following Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, when it was possible to envision the emergence of the nation committed to liberty and equality. And with us today is a colleague, also from Yale, Professor Akhil Amar, who returns to us and spoke here as part of a dynamic constitutional conference 10 years ago. Akhil Amar is the Sterling Professor of Law and Political Science at Yale University, where he teaches constitutional law in both Yale College and Yale Law School. After graduating from Yale College, summa cum laude in 1980, and from Yale Law School in 84, he clerked for Judge, later Justice, Stephen Breyer. Amar joined the Yale faculty in 1985 at the age of 26. My God. Yeah, wow. Amar's work has won awards from both the American Bar Association, the Federalist Society, and he has been cited by Supreme Court justices, not surprising, across the spectrum in over 45 cases. He is tops among scholars under age 65 in that regard. He regularly testifies before Congress at the invitation of both parties. And I want to reiterate that the conversations we have here, we try to be representative of all ideas, to be inclusive and thoughtful and have real dialogue and real conversation. Amar has written widely for popular publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, you name it. And you are likely to see him on TV on any given night that we're discussing our legal system or the Supreme Court. This is near and dear to my heart, our family's heart. He was an informal consultant to the popular TV show The West Wing, which my son lives by, The West Wing. And he's the author of several books, which we have in the back, most notably The Bill of Rights, America's Constitution, America's Unwritten Constitution, which was named one of the year's 100 best nonfiction books by the Washington Post in 2012. The Constitution Today, named one of the year's top 10 nonfiction books that year. And he also brought a few very choice copies of his most recent book, The Words That Made Us, America's Constitutional Conversation, 1760 to 1840. He has a weekly podcast for those of us who love podcasts called America's Constitution. I love that. And an online website. I want to add that both our speakers have written hundreds of articles, law review articles, newspaper articles, but they've also inspired hundreds, if not thousands, of law students, to pursue, discovery of our forming, our nation, our legal system, to keep questioning, to keep studying it, to keep ask questions about how we got here and anticipate the challenges we face tomorrow. And with that, I'm going to introduce both of them and ask them to come up to the stage and give them a loud round of applause. Thank you.
Well, so thank you for that introduction. It was a great introduction. Thank you to everyone for coming here. It's really a pleasure. And thank you, of course, also to Akhil for agreeing to be here with me. It's always an incredible treat to share a stage with Akhil. Akhil was one of my professors when I was a student at Yale. I learned a lot from him then. I continue to learn from him. I recommend all of his books highly. At particular moments, I'll probably say, this can't be wrong. I got this from you. But we'll see. So I think we're going to have just basically a free-form discussion for a bit, and I think we'll have plenty of time for questions. So we can also talk to the audience and respond to whatever you find interesting. And how should we begin?
Let me just say thanks for inviting me, and it's such an honor to, let's see here. Oh yeah, and it's such an honor and pleasure to be with Kim. I used to think that I teach law, and there's a bit of a joke there because I'm at Yale Law School, but we'll put that one aside. I now understand that I teach students. And there's no student I've ever had that I'm more proud of than Kim. So I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
All right. Well, maybe I'll start then just by trying to say a little bit about the book as an introduction. Because there are basically two things that I want to bring out. One is, I do think what I'm saying is accurate in some way. So I do think that history requires interpretation. I don't really believe that there's a single unique historical truth about the past. But I do think that the story that I offer, and this is something that you might have heard in the introduction, the story that I offer is in some ways more accurate than the story that we've been telling ourselves, the story that we've grown up with, the story that we teach in high school civics, for instance, or that politicians invoke when they're trying to call us together as Americans and tell us what our national identity is and what our purpose is and where our values come from. I do think I have a more accurate story. But maybe more important than that is the idea that this is more useful. Because one of the things that I was feeling most strongly as I was writing the book was that our standard story this idea that our values are stated in the Declaration of Independence in 1776, and we should identify with the American patriots who fought the Revolution and the Founding Fathers who drafted the Constitution, and that those are the people we should emulate. I feel like that idea is not working for America now. I think that people are looking at the past more critically. They're finding that if you look at it more critically, it's less inspiring. I think we're having a struggle about that nationally now. And I think that the anti-critical race theory laws that you might have heard about around the country, Florida has a whole bunch of these, Florida in particular, I find very striking because they have a law that says you must present American history as the development of a nation based on the universal principles, the Declaration of Independence, which is sort of the heart of what I think is wrong about the Standard Story.
So this book is banned in Florida, right?
This book is banned in Florida. Yes. So I think that there's a story we can tell about America that is better in that it's more appealing, it's more inspiring. It also is in some ways more accurate, but fundamentally I think it can do a better job of bringing us together. It can bring more people together. It can bring us together around the right values. It can include the right people, and I'm going to say it can exclude the right people too, because I think a national story is never going to be perfectly inclusive. But the story that I'm telling, and I'll just give maybe a tiny bit of this, the story that I'm telling tells us to think about American history generally not as a success story, not as a sort of inevitable progress from the ideals of 1776 and an inevitable path towards more fully realizing those ideals, but as a series of failures and reinventions, with our greatest progress really coming when we realize that we've failed and when we endure conflict and when we decide we have to actually stand up and fight for our values, even if that means breaking the existing system. So you can see that, I think, with, of course, the Revolution, which is where the Standard Story starts. And then you can see it, I think, with the replacement of the Articles of Confederation, our first attempt at national self-governance, by the Constitution. And then you see it most dramatically with the Civil War and Reconstruction. And really what I'm urging us to do is think more about the Civil War and Reconstruction as the birth of our nation, the birth of modern America, because that's where I think you really get the values that we hold dear entering into the Constitution. And that's where you get the America that we want to be. So much more than founding America, I say we should aspire to be Reconstruction America. We should aspire to develop the ideals that were articulated then. And for various complicated reasons, I think we've ended up with sort of a compromise where we say that our values are the values of Reconstruction, but we also say that they come from the founding. So the values that we say we believe in are really sort of the values of the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. But we say that they're in the Declaration of Independence, even though I believe, and this is a longer conversation and perhaps we'll talk about it, I believe they're not really there in the Declaration. So ultimately I'm saying we can tell a story that's more true and more inspiring. We can come together around the right ideals if we shift our national story and our sense of our origin about 80 years forward. So not the Revolution, but the Civil War, not the Declaration of Independence, but the Gettysburg Address, not the Revolutionary Patriots even, but maybe the soldiers of the Union Army. And those should be the heroes of our Constitution.
So we don't have as much time today as we'd like to explore all of these issues. It was mentioned that I have a free, and it's free, weekly podcast that you can listen to. And I want to mention that Kim has a very powerful lecture without me and the audience interrupting or anything. So just he gets to sort of present the basic thesis of this book, which I highly recommend, which is a new narrative about our country. But if you want to get a little bit more of a sense of it, obviously, we're going to talk about it today, but I highly recommend a lecture that he gave, which is also free. It was broadcast several times on C-SPAN. So if you just put Kermit Roosevelt C-SPAN, it was at the University of Pennsylvania, where he's a professor, and it was about a 1-hour distillation of the basic idea of the book. And again, that's free as well. Now, my own take is I think Kim is onto something very important, but I break off at a certain point. So here's where I agree with Kim. We can't root everything in all of the founders, because some of them actually should not really be our models, can't be our models. And that includes, and here's, I would say, what my agreement with him, and this is very dramatic, that includes Thomas Jefferson. And it's not just because of Sally Hemings, because that's complicated, truthfully. And here's why it's complicated. Because Sally Hemings is, and we now know, really, because of DNA, and we didn't know this 20 years ago with the kind of certainty that we know it now because of DNA. Sally Hemings was Jefferson's concubine, his mistress, if it were his a partner. Fine. That's complicated because she was his dead wife's half-sister. And on her deathbed, we think he kind of promised her, whether she asked for it or not, that he would never remarry. Now, he's in his early 30s, and now he's promised he's never going to marry. And now there's this person. She had the same father as his deceased wife, different mother, a black, half-white slave mistress. And maybe she reminds Jefferson of his wife, and he's promised he's never going to remarry. So life is complicated. You'll realize this when you grow up. That you know, as people age, things are but and that's what we've been focused on because it's salacious in a certain way, and it's soap opera-ish. Kim comes along and says, "Listen, we're missing the bigger point here. Forget Sally for just a moment. That union, so to speak, of the two of them produced multiple children. Jefferson never acknowledges them. That's bad enough. Think about not acknowledging your own children. Oh, but Kim tells us, and some of this is personal because the question is who your heroes are going to be. Choose your heroes carefully in life. It's not just the text, it's the people. So here's one of the more powerful formulations, and I actually think I heard it from Kim first. I'm going to disagree with Kim on some things, but yeah. I turned it on. Let's try it again. It's on. Okay, I'll have to just. Kim knows that I'm very good at shouting, but okay. Thomas Jefferson. Here's the point: enslaves his own children. Ooh, ooh, ooh. Okay, that's the point. It's not about Sally. I would say it's about the children, and we have to come to grips with that, and that's complicated. Here's the person who says we hold these truths to be self-evident, all men are created equal. Okay. Now, here's where I disagree. So that's where I agree with Kim. I think Thomas Jefferson's really a problem, and he actually has daft ideas about a whole bunch of things, and some of those daft ideas are actually going to lead to secession, okay, because he actually has revolutionary ideas that are picked up by his own family, who are secessionists, and that's not so, and I'm not on that side. So that's where I'm with Kim, that the founding is complicated. Here's where I disagree with Kim. The very same document that Jefferson claims ownership of, and on his obelisk, he says father of the Declaration of Independence, author of the Declaration of Independence. No. He wrote some of it. Other people participated. It's not his uniquely. It's not Virginia. Right there next to him, and you can see it on the back of, the Jefferson $2 bill. With John Trumbull's amazing painting about the Declaration of Independence. Right next to him is John Adams from Massachusetts and Benjamin Franklin from Pennsylvania, and they are very different from day one, and they mean different things from day one. So I think actually from the beginning, to borrow into a metaphor, it was a complicated marriage between the northern states and the southern states, and they had different visions. So on day one, the North actually is abolitionist, and it's actually going to get rid of slavery. They're all 13 colonies are slave colonies in June 1776. And then they adopt this text that says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, all men are created equal. And immediately, half of those colonies, including this one, will actually move toward freedom, okay? And two of them, Benjamin Franklin's Pennsylvania, they draft a constitution. When the ink is not even dry on the Declaration of Independence, it says all men are born equally free and independent. And then 3 years later, Pennsylvania passes a statute getting rid of slavery on a gradual basis. And in Massachusetts, John Adams drafts a constitution. Benjamin Franklin presides over the Pennsylvania Constitution of 1776. The ink isn't even dry on the Parchment Declaration. They borrow this phrase and provide for ending of slavery. Massachusetts will do the same thing in 1780. All men are born free and equal, and they're going to get rid of slavery. New York will follow, Connecticut, Rhode Island. And so from the beginning, there are two, in my view, different interpretations of the Declaration, the northern one and the southern one. We fight a civil war about that. And then final thought, if you're going to refound the nation on Reconstruction, you have to remember that Abe Lincoln claims, and I'm with him on this, that his is actually the better interpretation. I think his is actually, there's ambiguity, but here's what he says in language that is pretty famous. 77 years ago, and he's saying that in 1863, and you deduct 87, and that would be 1776, you see. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, not slavery, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And he means it in a more robust way than Jefferson did. Other people didn't quite mean it that way, but I'm actually with Lincoln. I think that's the better and truer. But at the beginning, they actually fudged.
Well, so I've thought a lot about this, and I've been persuaded by you of some things, and I think that like going into the true meaning of the Declaration is a very complicated topic, and I'm not sure we're going to be able to do it justice here. But so what I would say I have been persuaded by you on is this idea that founding America is a they and not an it. And from the beginning, there are different theories there. There are different sort of understandings about how society should be organized. There are different understandings about insiders and outsiders, and what duties the government has to outsiders. Maybe the best example of that is it wrong for the government to enslave outsiders? Can you form a political community and say, within this community, we all have rights that the government is bound to respect, but for people who are outside the political community, we have no duty to respect their rights, and we can enslave them if it's convenient for us. And perhaps, actually, it's illegitimate for the government to try to interfere with the enslavement of outsiders, because that would be interfering with the rights of insiders. So there are these two attitudes out there, and they're in tension from the start. But where I would disagree, I think, is in saying that that tension exists in the Declaration of Independence. So I think it exists in state bills of rights and state constitutions, because those are documents about how the internal affairs of a state should be conducted. It's about what kind of government we're setting up. It has to address the question, who's a member of our political community? What obligations do we have to outsiders? But the Declaration of Independence is not about that. The Declaration of Independence is about the relationship between the colonies and the British Crown. It's about relationships within a political community. Doesn't have to address the question at all of outsiders it doesn't have to address the question at all of whether enslaving outsiders is wrong. It does talk about slavery. A big theme of the colonists' argument, one of the charges that they're leveling against King George is he is trying to make them slaves. He's trying to enslave the colonists. And that is a terrible thing, and the theory of the Declaration tells you that it's wrong because governments exist to protect the natural rights of the people who form them. So if you're enslaving your own citizens, that's wrong. That makes you illegitimate. People don't have to respect your authority anymore, and they can declare independence. And independence is what the Declaration is about. It's about where legitimate political authority comes from and when it can be rejected. And the phrase, all men are created equal, matters to that because there was a theory out there that said all men are not created equal. Some men are chosen by God to rule over others, and therefore you can't rebel. You can't rebel against the king no matter what he does because he is your sovereign by the grace of God. And that's what all men are created equal is doing in the Declaration. It's saying there is no such thing as the divine right of kings. Legitimate political authority comes from consent. When it goes against its purposes, it can be rejected. All of that is central to the argument for independence, but it's entirely unrelated to the question of enslaving outsiders. So the Declaration, I would say, we think of now as though it embodies moral principles about how the government must treat outsiders, these universal ideals of liberty and equality. But it's not understood that way in 1776, and some evidence of this is that people didn't think the preamble was significant. People didn't pay a lot of attention to the preamble. They did think that the Declaration of Independence was significant because it does something. It severs the relationship between the colonies and the British Crown. But they didn't think that the statement, all men are created equal, was particularly significant because it was just part of this boilerplate Enlightenment social contract theory. It rejects the divine right of kings. After the Glorious Revolution, the British monarchy didn't even rely on the divine right of kings. So it doesn't get a lot of attention. And there's an article, I should say, by Pauline Maier called The Strange History of All Men Are Created Equal that goes through this history in great detail, which I find very persuasive and I found very valuable in writing the book. But so the general point is the Declaration of Independence doesn't have to say anything about enslaving outsiders, and so it doesn't. When we get to the Constitution in 1787, they will have to talk about slavery, and they do talk about slavery. But the 1776 Declaration is not about the relationship between a government and outsiders, and that's why when the northern states abolish slavery, they say different things. They talk about people who are born within their political community, saying that they're born equal. And when the freedom suits are brought in Massachusetts, which lead to the eradication of slavery, they rely on the Massachusetts Constitution. Now, the litigants do invoke the Declaration of Independence also, but the judge doesn't rely on it. The judge says the Massachusetts Constitution is what tells you how people must be treated in Massachusetts. And the Declaration of Independence really doesn't relate to that.
So let's pivot a bit to where we especially agree, because this, it's an interesting kind of, a point between us, but maybe most important for them is to just hear a fundamentally different narrative, which is Reconstruction focused. Just two sentences on the disagreement. I read the Declaration as it is boilerplate. It's borrowing from Locke, word for word for word. Jefferson denies that he even had Locke in front of him. And in an endnote in my preface, I show you that there are 5 passages lifted from Locke. Now, Jefferson says this 50 years later, and he's trying to claim credit, and it's perfectly okay to copy. It's not plagiarism. He himself says, and Pauline Maier wrote a whole book about this, that he's distilling all sorts of American statements. But he actually says, I never read Locke, and I, using, in effect, plagiarism software, in effect, say, no, it's just straight up from Locke. Locke, in turn, says, I'm getting it from the judicious Hooker, who is a theologian, who actually says, all men are created equal, and what that means is that no man can actually treat another man as a beast, as an animal to be tamed. No man can reduce another equal person of the same species to subjection, that we actually have not just rights but duties, and we can't actually take away anyone else's life, liberty, happiness, safety. So I actually think that the better reading is that when you understand that it's coming out of Locke and Hooker and a whole a theological tradition, as to which Kim says, and he's right, well, no one's paying much attention to that preface. They are not. This is pretty much boilerplate. They devote a day and a half to the thing because they have other things to worry about, like the King of England is setting over 30,000 troops and they're about to land, on these shores, and we got to get ready. And South Carolina has other things to do than to quibble about this stuff. So I think in the end they agreed to language that they weren't paying close attention to and that has a certain logic to it. But I'm with Kim in thinking not everyone understood this. I think Lincoln has the better understanding, which is what he proclaims at Gettysburg, and he's building on Charles Francis Adams, who's building on a fellow named Jay, not just John, but his son William, who's an abolitionist. And this is the story I'm telling in the book that I'm working on right now, and I changed the title this morning. The title had been Becoming Equal, and I changed it to Born Equal, because I think that's the idea. It really is this born equal idea. And whether born equal is the same as created equal, or whether you can, somehow distinguish between the two, you're naturally equal, you're by nature equal, you're born equal, you're created equal. Okay, we can talk about all that. Here's, though, where Kim and I fundamentally agree. The Constitution failed. We call that failure a civil war. And it failed in part because there was not deep, deep harmony across the country on this question. They basically finessed it. I've been married very happily 33 years. Kim has been very happily married for a long time. And if you have a fundamental unity of vision and value between the spouses, that's a much better basis for a union than when you don't. The North basically did not have actually, they saw the world very different, especially in South Carolina. It just, from day one, this was, and the North thinks, oh, we can change him. No, do not marry someone thinking you can change him. That's unlikely to succeed. Just okay. So, and that's why, here's one other analogy, and this is the United States and the Soviet Union worked together to defeat Hitler. But we had fundamentally different visions and values, and immediately after that, we actually are moving in different directions. Patton understood this from day one, and you're seeing it right now with Putin and Ukraine. So that's what 1776 was, a shotgun marriage of convenience for geostrategic purposes, an alliance because we had to hold together to beat the Brits, but we actually finessed this issue. We didn't hash it out. We really didn't. And that's going to lead to a civil war because these societies are moving in different directions. But now, after the Civil War, I think Kim and I both think we are emphatic in our highest law what our deepest values are. 13th Amendment, no slavery, and indeed, it's immediate, universal, uncompensated abolition of a Russian Revolution redistribution story. Wow, this is big. And we do it because there was a war. And civil equality from day one. The first sentence of the 14th Amendment says everyone born in America is born an equal citizen, born equal, created equal. That's why the new book, I just changed the title, Born Equal. And then the 15th Amendment says, oh, not just civil equality, like the right to sue and be sued, to have religious liberty, to make contracts, to have freedom of speech and of the press, but political equality. The 15th Amendment says actually no racial distinctions in voting, in jury service, in military service, in office holding and governmental service. Wow. And the 19th Amendment will build on that and say, actually, people are born equal in every respect, civil and political, male and female, as well as black women. What does it mean to be born equal or created equal? That's what Kim and I both agree is the real center of our Constitution. That's what we should be thinking about. And I think Kim and I think, and then I'll let him back in, whether he agrees, because it's a deep, deep idea. I think it goes back to the Enlightenment and Locke, but it's building on it. Okay, it means you're equal whether you're born black or white, whether you're born male or female, whether you're born in wedlock or out of wedlock, whether you're born first in your family or fifth, no primogeniture and entail, whether you're born to citizen parents or to alien parents. My parents weren't citizens when I was born. I would be equal having been born in Ann Arbor, Michigan, even my parents weren't here legally, in fact. Born equal. I would say you're born equal whether you're born gay or straight if we're with Gaga and believing that some people are born this way. Okay, this is a deep, deep idea that the Supreme Court is even now just catching up with. And Kim, I think that's where you and I have our biggest agreement.
Yes. I think we do have a lot of agreement there. Possibly the aspect of disagreement or the way that I want to present it slightly differently is I'm saying that's our big American idea, that's what we believe in, that's what we're committed to, and it comes as part of a revolution that destroys founding America. Right? So that latter part, I'm not sure that you agree with.
It destroys half of the country or a third of the country, it demolishes it.
Yes.
And I was recently at, I did an event in Atlanta where justices of the Georgia Supreme Court there, and here's how I began. There were several hundred people in the audience. I said, I hate Gone with the Wind. My favorite scene, these were opening sentences. My favorite scene is the burning of Atlanta. Okay? Because I believe that one Atlanta had to burn away, and in its ashes, another Atlanta had to be reborn. Phoenix, like Lincoln, ends that addressing a new birth of freedom. And I love Atlanta today. It's a world-class, inclusive city of blacks and whites and great historically black colleges and many other places. It hosted the Olympics, and it could never have done that unless a certain part of founding America was destroyed. Yes, I agree with you. Not all of America, but a big part of it, yeah.
Yeah, so not all of America, but I say basically the existing political system. So let me give you quickly the Reconstruction as revolution argument, and then maybe we'll move to questions. I don't know exactly where we are in the timing. But so here we are, right? We've got the Civil War, right? Gosh, what an amazing, terrible thing. 13 states or 11 states, depending on how you count them, depending on whether you count Missouri and Kentucky, have said they're going to leave the Union and start something new.
And Kim likes 13 because it puns on the 13 colonies, but it's
yeah,
11.
And that's why the Confederates like it too.
On your AP history, do not say 13, right. Okay? Because Aaron Hull will give you a low grade.
I'll go back to 11. It works better in some ways if you say 11 also. So what can they rely on for this? They're relying on the Declaration of Independence. Now, there's a complicated argument about whether secession is legal, and I think Akhil has actually brought me around to the idea secession is illegal under the Constitution. But I do think the Declaration of Independence pretty clearly supports the people who are declaring their independence, rather than Abraham Lincoln, who is refusing to let them leave the Union. So in that respect, I think the Gettysburg Address is somewhat strange that Lincoln says he's fighting for the Declaration of Independence, when in fact he's fighting against people who have declared their independence.
And on that, just on that, so here, we agree the Constitution doesn't support secession. Kim thinks the Declaration does because it's about revolution and actually local rights. Colonies can revolt. Why can't states revolt? And I would say they can revolt only if they can submit facts to a candid world showing that the regime is tyrannical. And King George was, and Abraham Lincoln wasn't. So I'm with Lincoln on that as well.
Okay. So we have the Civil War. At a certain point, most historians agree on this. I think the nature of the war changes. Lincoln initially is fighting for Union. Then by the end, he's fighting to end slavery. James Oakes has pointed out, and I agree with this, Lincoln was always anti-slavery. Lincoln wanted to end slavery. But he didn't think he had the power. and he wasn't going to try to directly abolish slavery. That wouldn't have happened if not for the Civil War.
And this is a short book by Jim Oakes called The Crooked Path to Abolition. It's very economical, like this one. I tend to write long, tedious ones. And I recommend that, and I think Kim recommends that
Yes.
to your consideration.
I do. So we get the 13th Amendment. Slavery is abolished. This seems dramatic. Is it a revolution? Well, it's pretty dramatic in that it's immediate abolition. And when the northern states abolished slavery in the years before the Civil War, they often did it gradually.
And with
So-
compensation.
And
Yeah.
with compensation. I mean, yes, I'm going to get to that. So this is really cool, though. So they often do it gradually. They do it with compensation. When slavery is abolished in Washington, D.C. during the Civil War, they pay compensation. So gradual abolition, compensation, that's what you do, I say, when you are reforming a government, a slave-holding government. A government where slavery is legal, you're abolishing it, you're reforming it, you do it gradually, you pay compensation. Then we get the 14th Amendment, which is even more radical. So the 14th Amendment says a couple of stunning things, which Akhil has talked about already, which are, I say, at the center of our constitutional identity now. One of them is birthright citizenship, which breaks open the closed political communities of the southern states and says you will accept the formerly enslaved people as equal citizens. And then uncompensated emancipation. So the 14th Amendment says there will be no claims for rebel debt. All such claims are illegal and void. And you might think, well, of course, right? We're not going to pay rebel debt. That's based on Confederate laws. The Confederacy was illegitimate. I agree. Then it goes on and says there shall be no claims based on emancipation. All such claims are illegal and void. Claims based on emancipation are just like claims based on rebel debt, sort of void from the beginning, fundamentally illegitimate. And again, you might think, well, of course, right? Claims based on emancipation, why would we honor the Confederate laws of slavery when the Confederacy was never a legitimate government? But the point there is those weren't just Confederate laws. So they existed in the South before secession, of course, and they existed in states that stayed in the Union, like Delaware, Maryland, and then Missouri, Kentucky, right? If you say it was 11 states and not 13. And all of those laws are
Those
wiped
states.
away.
Yes. Even loyal masters in loyal states
Oh, yeah.
lose slaves with no compensation, like John Marshall Harlan's family.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So
Yeah.
all of those
Radical
laws are
stuff.
wiped away as if they were never legitimate.
Yeah.
Right. So you pay compensation if you recognize this was a legitimate law. We're changing it. We're taking property that you had a legal right to. If you say uncompensated emancipation, that really seems like revolutionary change. You are destroying the prior political order because it is unjust
Yes.
and illegitimate
I agree
and
with
must
you.
be overthrown.
Totally.
And Congress drafts this amendment and they send it out to the states and the states say no. Right? The 14th Amendment is rejected by the former Confederacy and then also by Delaware and Maryland. Right? And then Ohio and New Jersey later try to withdraw their acceptances. And it seems pretty clear this thing's not going to be ratified. So then Congress wipes out the governments of 10 of the former Confederate states, sparing Tennessee because it ratified the 14th Amendment, but it declares that no legitimate governments exist in those states, and it creates new states, basically, that will ratify the amendment and will go along with this wholesale rejection of the prior legal regime insofar as it relates to slavery. And if you look at that, I say that is a revolution. That is making a new nation. And it's making a new nation by rejecting a very substantial part of what went before. And we should embrace that. We should embrace the idea that Reconstruction is a revolution that gives us our modern American values.
Yes. And the only thing I want to say on that, I agree with everything that Kim said. The only thing I want to add is, in my view, the revolution was legal. And here is where I part company with my teacher, our teacher, Professor Bruce Ackerman. And it's very similar. And here's why these southern governments are kind of wiped away, because they're not letting black people vote. And that's not properly Republican as we, the Republican Party of the 1860s, understand the thing. And they say, what do you mean? We were Republican in 1860. Why aren't we Republican now? And you say, well, you disfranchised slaves back then, but now they're free. It's one thing to disfranchise slaves. They're not part of the polity for reasons that Kim talked about. The Greeks had democracy, but they enslaved other peoples. They called them barbarians because they didn't speak Greek. It sounded to the Greek ear as if these foreign languages were bar, bar, bar. So it's one thing to exclude people who aren't part of your polity or slaves, but because they said, we were Republican in 1859. What are you talking about? Yes, but now you're excluding free people. And they say, well, you don't let blacks vote in Ohio. And they say, yeah, but that's 2% of the population in Ohio, and it's 60% of the population in South Carolina. And don't you see the difference? And they say, yeah, but what about women? And the Republicans say, shut up. Kim is asking us rightly to look in the face, Reconstruction, come to grips with what it actually did. It's as revolutionary in certain ways as the founding. I want to say it's legal, but it's as revolutionary, it's more inspiring, and if we do that, I think Lincoln rises, the Jay family rises, including William Jay and John Jay at the founding, and Hamilton, who was anti-slavery from the beginning. Washington frees the slaves. I do think Jefferson falls, as does his namesake, Jefferson Davis. And it's not for nothing, that some of these folks are in the Jefferson tradition. So we should probably we should get them in?
Yeah, let's do it.
His teacher's named Aaron Hull, this one? Yeah, the Kansas City Royals. Sure? Okay. Aaron Hull is a high school teacher in Greenwich, Connecticut, and is doing a great job teaching our children the story of America.
So, Professor Amar, you and I have had this dialogue and this question before. I'm very curious what your feeling on this. Kind of as a practical matter, it seems like the disenfranchisement, the book you're writing is very aspirational and hopeful. It's negative about where the story gets it wrong, but it's aspirational and hopeful. Is that solution either in the abandoned privileges and immunities or in the second clause with the disenfranchisement of people across the country as a political tactic now?
So the solution to voter suppression? Is that?
In part, yes. That part of what we're failing to get is much more universal suffrage and access as part of the political battle today. Does that answer some of the thesis, the aspirational thesis that you're driving at?
Let me just add one thing. The words, the right to vote, this will shock you. The words, the right to vote, do not appear in the Declaration of Independence quite, because South Carolina and Massachusetts are never going to agree on stuff like that. And they don't appear in the Constitution, because South Carolina and Massachusetts are never going to agree on that. The first time, now that phrase appears 5 times in the Constitution, but the first time is in Section 2 of the 14th Amendment, which says if the right to vote is deprived from a certain set of folks, there will be an apportionment penalty in the House of Representatives and the Electoral College. And the 15th Amendment says no deprivation, no abridgment of the right to vote on grounds of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. The 19th Amendment says no abridgment of the right to vote on the basis of sex. In our lifetime, some of us, the 24th and the 26th Amendment says no abridgment of the right to vote on grounds of poll tax disfranchisement and age if you're between 18 and 21. But here's a point for Kim and me. We agree on this, that the original Constitution really has a real democracy gap, democracy deficit to it. Because of race and slavery, they can't do certain things that we today think are fundamental. And if we accept Kim's narrative, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are the place in American history where we start to make amends for all of that. But anyway, I'm giving you some time to think about your answer.
Yeah, so absolutely I agree with that. And like to plug my Reconstruction is better than the founding perspective, I would say if you look at the Declaration of Independence and ask what makes a government legitimate according to the criteria set out here, It is that it's formed by consent and that it protects the natural rights of the people who form it. Doesn't have to be a democracy. And this is actually a point that I got from Akhil. Yeah, so it has to be right. Otherwise, they don't have to show that George is a tyrant. They just could have said George is a king, right? And monarchy is illegitimate because it has to be a democracy. But that's not what the Declaration is doing.
And that would not have flown very well with the French to say that all monarchy is illegitimate. You're going to need their money and their military force. So this is not the theory of the Declaration.
Right. And then if you go through the Constitution, the original Constitution, looking for democracy, basically what you find, and this is Akhil's point, is there are gestures towards democracy, but it's basically as far as the states want to go. So the Constitution occasionally takes state law inputs and says, you know, you can vote for a representative if you're allowed to vote for the most numerous house of the state legislature. But the federal Constitution is not forcing the states to expand the franchise, and in some ways it's designed to insulate them from pressure to do that. That's one of the things the Electoral College does.
Under the Electoral College, it doesn't matter whether you let a lot of people in, let's say, New York vote, or a few people in New York, right? New York is the same number of electoral votes, whether it lets a lot of people vote or a few people vote. Think about how women's suffrage would have played out differently without the Electoral College. Let's say in 1900, 4 states are letting women vote, Colorado, Idaho, Utah, and Wyoming. The others aren't. Without the Electoral College, any state that decides it's going to enfranchise its women has just doubled its clout in a national popular vote. But the Electoral College basically holds harmless any state that has a restrictive franchise.
It's like a tag team. So now, go on to Reconstruction and the Civil War, and you've got the Gettysburg Address. And what makes a government legitimate according to the Gettysburg Address? Democracy, because it's of the people, by the people, for the people. So now the idea of democracy is really there, I'm saying. And yes, you get that through the 14th Amendment, and then particularly in the 15th Amendment, where we ban racial discrimination in voting. But of course, the 15th Amendment by itself doesn't do very much. And what can the Supreme Court do? Not very much, Justice Holmes says in Giles v. Harris, and I think he's probably right, that the Supreme Court on its own cannot protect voting rights, which is why you need the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And that's when it really starts becoming meaningful, and unfortunately now the Supreme Court is taking that away from us. So my view on voter suppression and disenfranchisement generally is the federal government was doing a pretty good job protecting voting rights, and the federal government and legislation and enforcement and pre-clearance was doing a lot there, and the Supreme Court is kind of the problem in recent years.
And since we're talking about like founding fathers, I'm going to embarrass Kim just a little bit here. But in the 1860s, you see, it's the Republican Party. I'm a Democrat, but it's the Republican Party that are the heroes. And that's true basically for, much even of the 20th century. Eventually, the Democratic Party will actually, which is the party of Jefferson Davis and secession and segregation and slavery, that will flip under Lyndon Johnson and champion a Voting Rights Act with the votes of some Lincoln Republicans, the proto-David Souter types. But I'm going to embarrass you because your family basically makes the shift from Republicans to Democrats at just the right time. The Roosevelt family are
That's
basically...
not embarrassing.
No, I mean in a good way. You're Republicans at a time when they're the good guys on voting, and then your family kind of switches over to Democrats at about the time that Democrats get religion on voting rights. And now our party, I would say, is more emphatic about voting rights than the other party.
I would agree with that.
And we both adore David Souter.
Yes, absolutely.
Who is, the original Lincoln Republican. And if you ever get a chance to meet David Souter, for whom he clerked, you see, ask him about Gettysburg. Did he take your group of clerks to Gettysburg?
He didn't take us.
Almost every year he takes
missed that, but almost every year, he took his clerks to Gettysburg.
Yeah, no, he gave a lecture once on Gettysburg, and I actually had tears in my eyes.
So if Thomas Jefferson was never knowledge deal or when that even happened?
Wow, that's one of the great questions. That's a very, very, if Thomas Jefferson, see, you're asking a very, very deep historical question. Here's what you're asking, what if, if this hadn't happened, would it have made a difference? If Hitler had never been born, would we have had World War II? We can't be sure. We can't, like scientists, go into a laboratory and run the experiment. I hope you're learning about the scientific method. There's a control group and there's an experimental group, and you change one thing and then you run the experiment again. History doesn't quite work that way. It only happens once. We can't go back and try to eliminate Thomas Jefferson in the experiment and then run the experiment again. You're asking one of the great questions of all of American history, the most profound question, which is, when did the Civil War become inevitable? Okay, and we can't be sure about that. And you're also asking a second and related, really, really deep, amazing question about history, which is, what causes what? It turns out to be a really hard question for serious historians to answer. What caused what?
I have nothing to add to that. That was great. Great answer.
Yes, thank you so much. I think this is a very provocative conversation, but I wonder whether we shouldn't go a bit deeper, if you don't mind, because I believe that this country is in this very difficult conversation simply because maybe that we have put too much emphasis on the scriptures and what is written, on the Western civilization of believing that once you have written, people will more easily agree. It happens to be that, in my own very humble opinion, the problem starts with the notion of how we are born, or if or how we are created. In that sense, the birth of racism, which was the basis of slavery, which created apartheid in South Africa, I think is based on the scriptures. And if you read the holy books, as you must have done, I'm sure, of all monotheist religions, the black person in those holy books is at the lowest level of the ladder. And the basis of disenfranchisement, the black people, is based on something that is actually written in the Holy Scriptures. You can cite all the holy books that matter for Western civilization, from the Bible, the Quran, the Sefer Yetzirah, and even books in Asia. So I was wondering whether here in the United States, the conversation and the misunderstanding between people who went to the same school, who had more or less the same values, I wonder whether they didn't go deep enough, because the whole notion of creation, of being equal at birth, cannot be fully understood if you do not challenge the basis of the scriptures. And that basis in the scriptures is one, which is one that the black people are going to be trampled with a foot like if they were at the same level of the snake. So I think there is a conversation on religion, which is part of the poison in the conversation. And I was wondering whether, beside the books of laws and the Constitution, you shouldn't challenge what created this country in the sense of the scriptures, which has still not been, in my view, challenged enough. That's why you had an elected president in this country treating other countries from the mother of all continents, as shithole countries, whereas a country that suffered from slavery, Haiti, saved his grandfather from sinking. So, thank you.
So I have a different view. I think that even the devil can quote scripture, and that there are different interpretations of these canonical texts. The South has its interpretation of the Bible And its favorite passages include the Pauline admonition from St. Paul, slaves, obey your masters, wives, obey your husbands. And there are other deep Christian traditions that actually read the scriptures very differently, as affirming the fundamental equality of all humanity. So the debates about slavery and about this sentence, all men are created equal, actually are paralleled by debates about Scripture. So I would want to say there are really important abolitionists who actually are deeply rooted in religious traditions, including Christian traditions. They include the Puritans. The place that gets rid of slavery first, is a very, very religious part of the country. It has a different understanding. It's New England. And this is the Jay family, since we're here, and they're an abolitionist family, and their abolitionism is not unconnected to their reading of the scriptures. Again, they're different interpretations of the scripture. Since you mentioned Haiti, Frederick Douglass, he's an abolitionist. He believes that everyone's equal, and he has a certain reading of the scriptures that's very different than John C. Calhoun's. What I will finally say is, here's what is amazing about America is that, and Lincoln is invoking certain biblical strains when he has passages like 4:7. That's because in the King James Bible, the life of man is 3:10. He has all sorts of biblical resonances. He's not a conventional churchgoer, but he's pretty deeply spiritual, and you can't read the second inaugural address by Lincoln without getting a profound sense of, and he says it might be weird that they both pray to the same God, and yet they're just and yet they have very different understandings of slavery. One thing I'll finally say is, putting aside the Christian and Jewish scriptures, none of that is American constitutional law. American constitutional law is not based on this religious text or that one. And one thing that's, I think, amazing about America is that today, that we have not only the children and grandchildren of all the continents of the world, since you mentioned Africa. My mom grew up in Africa, so did my wife, but of all the religions. There are not very many societies today that try to bring together all the religions. Today, since you mentioned divine right of kings, Charles is going to have to actually pledge to be defender of the faith at his coronation, and it's going to have to be administered by an Anglican bishop or archbishop, okay? And he's going to have to swear on not just any Bible, but the King James Bible, the Douay Bible, the Catholic Bible, the Apocrypha will not do. And actually, if you've seen The Crown, there's a moment at which he's going to be anointed with holy oil. I promise you, this is like episode 3 in season 1 of The Crown, okay? And we don't have that in America. So there are countries that have a Sharia law and all the rest that are theocratic. We don't, and I think it's good that we don't.
Yes, well, so what we have is the Constitution, which in some ways is our sacred text.
Yes.
And you take an oath to the Constitution, and you swear to defend the Constitution.
And you don't even say, so help me God. You can choose to say it, but that's not in the words of the Constitution.
Right. But what I think is interesting is that the Constitution and religious texts are actually function in a very similar way, to some extent. Because with both of them, I think people think that writing something down fixes meaning, but it turns out that it doesn't. And people think that meaning doesn't change. And that's also not really true if you just look at history. And people think the Constitution motivates you and tells you what to do. And they think religion motivates you and tells you what to do. But actually, in both cases, I think human needs drive the evolution of religion and constitutional interpretation just as strongly as these texts tell us what to do. So if you look through history, one thing you'll find is that ideas about the meaning of the Constitution that now seem kind of crazy to me, that I always confidently taught my students were wrong, were actually accepted, broadly accepted, during different periods of constitutional thought. And people fight over the meaning of the Constitution. This is an idea that I think Jack Balkin has developed really well, that one thing the Constitution does, we often think, is solve our basic arguments. And sometimes it does that. It solves the argument over slavery. But more often it actually gives us a space in which we can argue for our preferred interpretation of particular values, like what is liberty, what is equality. And so if you look at history, you see people sort of struggling for possession of these important sacred texts. That's one of the things that happens with the Declaration of Independence in the years up to the Civil War, and even through the Civil War, because in the early years, the Southerners tried to hold onto it, and they celebrated July 4th, and they said, we are the heirs of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, and then in the end, they gave that up. And that happens with the Constitution. In the argument about slavery before the Civil War, there are pro and slavery interpretations. And of course, it happens with religion too. So if you look at debates over slavery before the Civil War, you will see religious arguments on both sides, as Akhil was saying. And of course, that changes. So religions change their views about what they say about slavery. And religion does evolve. This is one of the things that I think people find it hardest to see. We think that your religion tells you to do something and you have no choice in the matter, and that's what the religion says, and no one can change it. But if you look at history, if attitudes shift against a particular practice or a particular kind of discrimination, and my prediction is we're going that way with sexual orientation, if a particular kind of discrimination becomes really unpopular and society as a whole thinks this is bad and people who engage in it are reprehensible, it becomes unacceptably costly for a religion to continue to endorse that because it makes the religion less popular. And so the religion adapts because it has to survive. If it doesn't change, it won't survive. So religions that persist and succeed actually do sort of respond to changes in societal attitudes.
And in my lifetime, Kim, when were you born? What year?
1971.
Okay, so in my lifetime, but not Kim's, there was a great preacher man, and his name was Martin Luther King, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and he's described in every textbook as a civil rights leader, but that's not how he would have described himself. He would have said, I'm a preacher of the gospel, the gospel of Jesus Christ, first, last, and always. Everything comes out of that. That's, I promise you, that's how he would have described himself. He's named for Martin Luther. And his famous letter from a Birmingham jail is about how it's very sad that white preachers in his society, are not actually, linking arms with him. And this is painful because he sees it. And the abolitionists, many of them were very much Christian crusaders, different faith traditions, Puritan, Unitarian, Quaker, Congregationalist, other. But in my lifetime, you got black preachers and white preachers right next door to each other, and it's very segregated. A Sunday at 10 a.m. In the South. Different religious interpretations of racial equality, and definitely in my lifetime. A great rabbi. A great rabbi, Heschel. Absolutely.
I think we have time for one more question. In the back there?
Theologian.
Yes, you. Oh. And then what we'll do is we'll sign books. We can ask questions next to the list. So one more question.
So here's my thought in terms of our founding fathers writing all men are created equal. When you commit something to a document or to a paper, knowing probably that some of them were thinking more broadly, saying that all men are created equal despite color and everything else, or station in life, and others obviously didn't share that thought. But once they committed it to paper, they knew that somehow this nation was going to have to purge itself somewhere along the line of the sins that it was entrenched in, right? So, and then Lincoln picks it up in his House Divided speech, where a House divided cannot stand and survive, right? And so that's one thought. And so the Civil War was inevitable. That's my thought. It had to happen. But secondly, I was in Savannah probably about 5 years ago. I went to visit in the state that at one time had slaves on it, and I was being given a tour by the docent that was there. And she made a reference to the war or something like that. And I said, oh, you mean the Civil War or something like that, right? And she said, no, the War of Northern Aggression. And I was, taken aback by that comment and thinking to myself, that we're still engaged in the Civil War in many ways. Maybe we're not standing across battlefields from each other, but also when we have election night, isn't there the red states and the blue states, right? So this dialogue has not ended.
And that's why his narrative is really important, because he says if we're going to come together, we actually have to come together, I think he's saying, and I'm agreeing, around the Union, and therefore against the Confederacy, and therefore it's not the recent unpleasantness or the War of Northern Aggression or even the war between the states. Okay, so I know that this institution is sort of nonpartisan, but I'm telling you as an historian that when Nikki Haley says utterly idiotic things, and you can see them, on YouTube, about secession and South Carolina history, that's why this matters. That's why this book is banned in Florida, okay? Kim is taking a position. I'm with him. And as to your first point, that you beautifully recapitulate, I think, Lincoln's basic idea. They put this in there knowing that one day that would force us as Americans to live up to the thing. You've been reading your Lincoln. It's very obvious to me that you've been reading your Lincoln. Keep reading your Lincoln. We should all read our Lincoln.
And speaking of Lincoln, thank you both so much. Well, hopefully we're going to take home some books, including yours, which is Lincoln, right? And thank you all for coming today. First, let's give our two speakers a big round of applause.